In 1941, as the conflict in Europe entered its second year, relations between Japan and the United States were rapidly declining. While the world observed Nazi Germany's territorial expansions, diplomatic attempts in the Pacific became increasingly desperate and seemingly in vain. Japan's new ambassador to Washington, Nomura Kichisaburo, sought to negotiate a comprehensive agreement to advance Japan's imperial goals while maintaining peace with the United States. Yet, as talks continued, Japan's military moved deeper into Southeast Asia. President Roosevelt froze Japanese assets, and an oil embargo posed a severe threat to Japan's existence. This video delves into the last months leading up to the attack on Pearl Harbor, exploring events unfolding behind the scenes, from Tokyo's last-minute changes in leadership to Sweden's unexpected diplomatic role as a neutral mediator once war broke out. You'll discover how Japan's peace efforts crumbled, how Sweden stepped quietly into a crucial humanitarian role, and how its diplomats, especially Wadar Bagi in Tokyo, facilitated dialogue between empires during the initial phases of a truly global conflict. If you've ever questioned what diplomacy looks like when it's already too late, this is that story. Recent developments in Japanese-American relations have become a source of significant worry for both nations. There is an urgent need to foster a better understanding of one another's positions to protect the interests and well-being of our two countries, thereby ensuring peace in the Pacific and maintaining the long-standing friendship between us. With these words, Nomura Kichisaburo introduced himself to President Franklin D. Roosevelt on February 14, 1941. More than a year into the European War, tensions between Tokyo and Washington were quickly escalating, and both sides were acutely aware of it. Nomura, a retired admiral of the Imperial Navy and former foreign minister, would engage in discussions with Roosevelt and Secretary of State Cordell Hull, aiming to reach a mutual understanding on issues concerning both the Pacific and Europe. Unlike Foreign Minister Matsuoka's negotiations in Moscow that led to the Neutrality Pact with Stalin, Nomura's goals in Washington were much more expansive, targeting strategic gains on multiple fronts. At the heart of the initiative was the aim to negotiate a resolution to Japan's imperial goals. This included seeking United States assistance in persuading Chiang Kai-shek to surrender in China, forming a new trade agreement with the United States, gaining access to raw materials, eventually neutralizing the Philippines, and promoting principles of non-intervention in Europe. This expansive Memorandum of Understanding was a monumental challenge, especially as the United States was actively moving away from its traditional neutrality regarding Europe. Roosevelt implemented the Lend-Lease Act on March 11, 1941, and was already working on post-World War II plans with Great Britain, as outlined in the Atlantic Charter on August 14th. The situation was further complicated by Matsuoka's rigid approach, as he resisted significant concessions to the Americans, insisting on negotiating from a position of strength. However, following Germany's attack on the USSR on June 22nd, Matsuoka's stance quickly lost popularity within the cabinet. Just a month later, on July 18th, the government was reshuffled yet again. With support from the Emperor, the Army, and the Navy, Konoe Fumimaro dissolved the cabinet only to reassemble it with mostly the same members, except for Matsuoka, who was replaced by Admiral Toyoda Teijiro. This political move was unusual. Never before had a Japanese prime minister directly succeeded themselves. The shuffle was merely needed to dismiss the impulsive and pro-German foreign minister without suggesting a shift toward the Americans, which in reality was what it signaled. Konoe aimed to achieve more in negotiations with the United States through a fresh approach at the Gaimusho. Unfortunately, the new cabinet struggled in its dealings with Washington. To avoid appearing weak, the new foreign minister stated that his term would maintain the goals of his predecessor. Meanwhile, the relentless pressure of the Japanese army in Indochina against the French indicated that Japan's stance hadn't changed. In meetings with ambassadors Grew and Craigie in Tokyo, Foreign Minister Toyoda was accommodating, assuring the American and British representatives of Japan's peaceful intentions in Southeast Asia. Yet both Washington and London regarded this as mere rhetoric. On July 26th, Roosevelt froze Japanese assets in the United States. Toyota's attempts to connect with Ambassador Grue failed, just as Prime Minister Konoe's overtures for a summit with President Roosevelt did. The Americans dismissed the Japanese perspective. On August 1st, Roosevelt imposed sanctions that included an oil embargo, which struck a nerve in Tokyo, as 80% of its oil was sourced from the United States, and its reserves were barely enough to last 2 years. Oil was the weak spot of the Japanese Empire. On September 4th, Envoy Widar Bag sent a bleak report to Stockholm, declaring Grue's hopes for a peaceful resolution without military conflict were utopian. While Baggy acknowledged Konoe's last-minute efforts to negotiate with Washington, he believed the military's relentless push for a new order in East Asia clashed with U.S. foreign policy. His insight proved correct. Just 2 days later, a secret imperial meeting resolved that force would be used against the United States if Nomura's negotiations failed. Not long after, Hull rejected Toyota's proposal for a summit. Within a month, Konoe found his options dwindling, leading to his resignation on October 16th. He was replaced by the former war minister and active duty general Tojo Hideki, a hardliner with little regard for diplomatic efforts. That evening, December 8th, 1941, Bagge sent a brief telegram to Stockholm stating, "The Japanese Foreign Ministry has officially notified the legation about the state of war between Japan, the USA, Great Britain, and the British Dominions." In the morning, Japan launched an attack on Pearl Harbor. The news of this unprovoked assault and the subsequent wave of declarations of war stirred strong reactions in the Swedish press. Left-leaning publications nearly unanimously viewed Japan's actions as yet another act of aggression, this time signaling the empire's downfall. Norskens Famine, the primary newspaper of the Communist Party, provocatively claimed that Japan will not survive this adventure. The samurai are on their way to commit harakiri. The Social Democraten likewise forecasted that Japan's inferior naval forces might only outmaneuver Anglo-Saxon navies temporarily, labeling the attack as an overall desperate move. The conservative Svenska Dagbladet thought this move was unwise, though not surprising, believing that this conflict would unfold differently from the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. They viewed the United States as unbeatable. Similarly, the liberal Göteborgs Handels- och Sjöfartstidning maintained that Japan's only chance for success lay in securing quick victories, warning that a prolonged war would lead to certain defeat. The sole publication showing even a glimmer of hope for Japan was the pro-German Aftonbladet. They suggested that the attack stemmed from misguided U.S. policies, insisting that the war's outcome was uncertain but could provide an opportunity to eliminate the Russian peril from Europe. However, this optimism was largely unfounded, as Japan had clearly opted to confront the United States, leaving the USSR neutral until August 1945. Most newspapers recognized the onset of a true world war, as the repercussions of the attack quickly reached Europe, prompting other Axis powers to declare war on the US, and vice versa. Swedish commentators attempted to gauge the monumental event's impact on their nation, though few mentioned Sweden's direct interests, like trading companies. Most analysts focused on the secondary effects related to the shift in Europe's power dynamics, ushering in a new reality with direct U.S. involvement. The tone and focus of these articles markedly differed from earlier conflicts in China during 1931 and 1937, when editorials pondered Sweden's potential actions. Back then, discussions about boycott movements, condemnation, or involvement through the League were lively. In 1941, however, calls for Swedish action in crisis management were conspicuously absent from the media. It seemed both commentators and readers had concluded that events in Asia were now clearly beyond Sweden's influence. As a result, the loudest call for action emerged around strengthening Swedish neutrality. Interest in Asian matters had hit an all-time low in Stockholm, to the extent that the Foreign Policy Committee barely acknowledged the new war. Discussions about the Far East lasted only a few minutes, focusing solely on trade implications and Sweden's role as a protecting power. Foreign Minister Günther mostly provided Parliament with a few basic facts. During the meetings on December 9, 1941 and February 17, 1942, the UU did not delve into Sweden's reactions to the new conflict. It simply acknowledged the entry of more nations into an already dire situation. This lack of discussion on Japan can be attributed to structural reasons, as 4 out of 5 political parties were part of the governing coalition, which weakened parliamentary power. From 1941 to 1943, neither the UU nor the Advisory Council of Foreign Affairs met frequently. In contrast, when looking at a real security threat, the UU Protocol from February 1942 mentions Germany on 180 pages, while Japan appears just 9 times. Additionally, the Riksdag debate on the same day barely touched on Japan or the New Pacific War. When Japan was mentioned, it was only regarding the types of weapons used and their effectiveness in air battles. The widening of World War II to include many new countries seemed irrelevant to Swedish lawmakers, who were primarily focused on the national situation and developments in Europe. Even in 1943, Japan was only briefly noted, such as on November 3rd, when it was mentioned that the empire dominated global rubber exports. On a national level, Japan had become merely a footnote in Sweden's foreign policy discussions. The neglect of East Asian affairs was not surprising given the grim outlook in Scandinavia. Germany had occupied Denmark and Norway, while Finland participated in the invasion of the Soviet Union, and Iceland fell under British control. Public discussions in Sweden were still stifled, daily essentials were rationed, and many men were conscripted to guard the borders. In this context, national security took precedence over concerns about Japan during the early 1940s. Intelligence was crucial, although genuine Swedish intelligence services had only been established in 1938 and remained unknown to the public until 1943. The military intelligence unit known as Section U was led by Colonel Carlos Adlercreutz, who had troubling ties to the military attachés of the Axis powers. The other significant organization was the General Security Service, which had broad powers and, over several years, intercepted 50 million private letters and wiretapped 11 million phone calls. This marked a peak in the period of national alert. Stockholm's role evolved into a hub for spies and covert operations of foreign powers, allowing for the collection and sharing of sensitive information on neutral ground. Propaganda from various belligerents filled the city, including newsletters from China and Japan reaching a select group of Swedes. After the battles of El Alamein and Stalingrad, it became clear the war had shifted. This shift was reflected in Sweden's official stance. By late 1942, Colonel Adlercreutz was replaced, and the police headquarters began welcoming Danish, Norwegian, and Anglo-Saxon visitors, a stark change from the earlier dominance of German officials. In the summer of 1943, the Swedish government announced that German soldiers could no longer traverse Swedish soil on their way back from Norway. From then on, Sweden's neutrality leaned towards the Allies. By October 1944, exports of ball bearings to Germany were halted, although the steel for manufacturing them was still sent. Sweden also adopted a more compassionate immigration policy. In October 1943, the country welcomed over 7,000 Danish Jews just before they were set to be deported to Germany. Even more remarkable was the arrangement that Folke Bernadotte struck with Heinrich Himmler, allowing many concentration camp inmates to be evacuated to Sweden. This occurred alongside the famed efforts of Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest, a Swedish diplomat who worked for the American War Refugee Board and was arrested by the Red Army, never to return. A similar fate awaited hundreds of Baltic and German ex-soldiers who made it to Sweden by boat as the Hansen government returned them to the Soviet Union. This ignited a heated moral debate in the newspapers, but it wasn't until 1994 that the Swedish government formally apologized to the last Baltic survivors. Unlike the limited effect Pearl Harbor had on political discourse in Stockholm, it significantly impacted the foreign ministry, particularly its diplomats. The war in Europe, along with Sweden's neutral stance and its diplomatic reach through legations and consulates around the globe, led to numerous requests for Sweden's so-called good offices. This practice involves one state providing civil administrative support to another. Good office services are offered for various reasons, especially when nations sever relations, and it's common for both to seek assistance from third states in civil matters regarding the state with which they've ended direct relations. The rationale is clear. Even amid fierce conflicts like wars, there are times when adversaries share common interests that can be addressed through negotiation, requiring intermediaries. Examples include ensuring the safety of citizens on enemy territory, repatriating diplomats and civilians, or caring for prisoners of war. In Japan's case, British, American, Dutch, and other enemy diplomats were promptly interned in their embassies and needed help to communicate and eventually return home. At the same time, the same situation applied to Japanese diplomats, such as Ambassador Nomura in the United States. The country providing good office services is often termed a protecting power. It's essential to note two key points. First, good office and protecting power services are given with the full understanding of both parties. This is expected since the receiving state must agree to the representational role of the third state. Typically, this isn't an issue as all warring states want their interests safeguarded, leading to mutually respectful treatment of their adversaries. Reciprocity in diplomacy is a fundamental principle even in times of war. Therefore, Sweden didn't engage in unfriendly actions by aiding a state within enemy territory. Secondly, Sweden maintained its neutrality and didn't become part of the diplomacy of the protected state through its assistance. Sweden managed clerical tasks for the citizens of the states it protected, but did not engage in the diplomacy of foreign governments, even while relaying messages between opposing nations. It had prior experience with its good offices, having previously protected Sardinian Italian interests in Austria during the mid-19th century. During World War I, Sweden safeguarded Bulgaria's interests in Great Britain starting in 1915, and later accepted 16 additional protecting power roles, which included protecting Chinese interests in German-occupied Belgium and Japanese interests in Russia. Consequently, Sweden was well prepared when the European conflict began. A week after Germany invaded Poland, the United Nations established an office dedicated to managing protecting power roles, known as Section B. This section's work involved representing foreign interests. Sweden was quickly asked to act as the protecting power for Poland and South Africa within the German Reich and for Germany and France and Egypt, essentially representing these countries' interests in enemy territories. As the war expanded, Sweden's role as a protecting power grew significantly. At its peak, Section B employed around 20 staff in Stockholm and about 150 abroad in embassies and consulates. Sweden's administrative strength was vital for implementing the mandate smoothly. In 1943, for instance, Section B processed approximately 15,000 documents and telegrams with a budget of Swedish krona 5 million. However, it's important to note that protecting power mandates could be somewhat formalistic. Sometimes, belligerents appointed a protecting power in areas where they had minimal interests, leading to little work for those powers. Conversely, there were situations where political issues blocked Sweden from formally assuming the protecting power role, yet its diplomats still managed to assist foreign citizens. Section B classified these situations as informal or de facto mandates. Japan frequently declined to grant diplomatic rights to occupied territories, which led to its refusal to recognize Sweden as the representative for Norwegian and Greek interests when their exiled governments sought assistance in Tokyo. Nonetheless, the Gaimusho did not prevent the Swedish legation from serving as a contact point for Norwegians and Greeks in Japan, effectively protecting their interests. Bagge also reached out to the UD to inquire about assisting Norwegians in Hong Kong, after it became apparent that the Gaimusho had denied Argentina's role as Norway's protecting power there in April 1942. Additionally, the consulate began regularly checking on Luxembourgian subjects starting in July 1942. The refusal to acknowledge enemy governments in exile was primarily intended to undermine their legitimacy, though it wasn't applied consistently. Japan did accept Sweden's representation of the Dutch government in exile, likely due to the significance of the Dutch East Indies, where Japan sought to safeguard its interests through Switzerland. Sweden engaged in both formal and informal protecting power mandates, totaling 135 from 1939 to 1945. Approximately a third of these were a direct or indirect result of Japan entering the war. Moreover, Japan was the country for which Sweden held the most protecting power mandates, with 25 for Japan, as illustrated in certain figures and tables. Conversely, Japan was also where Sweden protected the most foreign interests, totaling 13 mandates. On December 10th, the Gaimusho provided the Swedish legation in Tokyo with a list of regions where it sought Swedish protection for Japanese interests. This list encompassed British Empire territories in East and Southeast Asia, such as Burma, Ceylon, and northwestern India, along with the United States islands of Hawaii. This request was unusual since Japan had turned to Spain for representation on the United States mainland, but the situation in Hawaii was practical, given that Spain had no consulate there, despite the islands being home to over 400,000 people of Japanese descent, which represented more than a third of Hawaii's population. Many were already second or third generation immigrants who identified more as Hawaiian than Japanese, but some still maintained strong connections to Japan. Japan had a significant consulate in Honolulu, notoriously staffed by spies who relayed details about Pearl Harbor's military base to the Japanese Navy. This highlighted the vital need for a capable and willing protecting power on the island to advocate for Japan's interests. Sweden was a fitting choice, having operated an honorary consulate there since the 1850s. By 1941, the unpaid role was held by Gustaf Wilhelm Olsen, a dual U.S.-Swedish national. After emigrating to the United States in 1888, Olsen worked with hospitals and healthcare associations for years and was 65 at the time of his appointment, making him particularly suited for the humanitarian needs of Japanese internees. The role of a protecting power can be complex. In terms of U.S.-Japanese relations and neutral intermediaries, a unique aspect complicated matters, as belligerents were not required to select the same neutral state as their shared protecting power. Japan was represented by Spain in the U.S., but due to a lack of trust in Francoist Spain, Washington opted for Switzerland in Tokyo. This meant Sweden was the third neutral in U.S.-Japanese wartime diplomacy, tasked solely with Japan's concerns in Hawaii. This had significant implications concerning the evacuation of diplomats and civilians from the empire who were stranded in Japan. By early January 1942, the Swiss began formulating a plan for a prisoner exchange on neutral ground in Lourenço Marques, the capital of Portuguese Mozambique in southeastern Africa. The primary players in this civilian exchange program were the United States, Great Britain, and Japan, as they each had the most citizens on foreign soil. Since Sweden was Japan's protecting power in Hawaii, it needed to be involved in the negotiations. Furthermore, the collaboration between Washington and London to facilitate these exchanges added an extra layer of complexity, as Britain's protecting power in Japan was Argentina at that time, only switching to Switzerland in May 1942. Involving 4 neutral countries in discussions among 3 warring nations brought 7 governments into delicate negotiations. This created a complex scenario rife with potential misunderstandings. Minister Bagge had to coordinate daily with his Swiss and Argentinian counterparts to push the talks on exchanges forward. To streamline the process, he decided that Sweden would leave all sensitive negotiations to the main protecting powers. He emphasized that while Sweden looked after Japanese interests in Hawaii, the principles governing the evacuation had to be established through Swiss mediation. Switzerland was at the forefront of the negotiations in Tokyo, and Bagge monitored their progress closely. Throughout the following year, the Swedish legation consistently cabled updates about the status of evacuation ships and the discussions between the United States and Japan back to the United States Department. A critical issue managed by Stockholm was the provision of ships. Since Switzerland had very few vessels registered under its flag, and none large enough for the over 1,000 passengers intended for the exchange, the Swedes arranged for their cruiser, the Gripsholm. This magnificent ship was painted in Red Cross colors to indicate its status as a hospital ship under international diplomatic protection. In Tokyo, Minister Bagge immediately began addressing the needs of the nationals in his care. The Dutch were the first to request Sweden's assistance after their government in exile declared war on Japan alongside the United States and Britain. Similar to the Anglo-American embassies, the Dutch legation was sealed off, leaving its diplomats confined to their homes. On December 10th, Bagge managed to connect with the Dutch minister and relayed information about the meeting back to the government in exile via Stockholm. The following day, the Swedish legation sent the first telegram from Belgian ambassador Forthom to Stockholm since his foreign ministry, also in exile, chose to sever diplomatic ties with Japan, just shy of a formal declaration of war. The same went for the Norwegian and Mexican legations, whose governments cut relations on December 9th, subjecting their diplomatic missions in Tokyo to the same treatment as those from declared belligerents. The Japanese military police, known as the Kenpeitai, did not make a distinction between enemy nations and those without diplomatic ties. Communication with their governments had been cut off, and their embassies were isolated. In just a few days, the Swedish legation began protecting nationals from Belgium, Bolivia, Honduras, and Mexico as well. Minister Bagge could occasionally visit the leaders of the missions he protected, but not nearly as often as he wished. He voiced his concerns about these restrictions at the Gaimusho, but often found it ineffective, as even they struggled to change the Kenpeitai's behavior. This urgency made it essential to evacuate enemy diplomats and civilians quickly. After lengthy negotiations, Bagge's American allies from Bolivia, Honduras, and Mexico were included in the first ship bound for the United States, while European nationals from Belgium, the Netherlands, Norway, and Greece were set to leave on the next vessel a few days later. British Ambassador Craigie, part of the second group of evacuees, vividly recalls the joy of reuniting with colleagues after nearly 8 months without contact. To inform potential evacuees about repatriation options, the legation published several notices in Japanese newspapers. Overnight, the Swedish legation in Tokyo found itself with a wide array of new responsibilities. For Minister Bagge, it was evident that this scenario would lead to a considerable increase in his staff's workload. Before the year's end, he requested additional diplomatic personnel, a Swedish diplomat from Moscow, if feasible, since that individual could reach Tokyo relatively quickly. Bagge also sought permission from his ministry to hire local staff, whether Japanese or foreign. This was a reasonable request. The correspondence between the legation and Stockholm doubled in volume during the 4 years of war. In contrast to earlier times, when only 1 or 2 telegrams were exchanged each week, after December 7th, it became routine to send daily messages covering various topics. By December 11th, Bagge had already brought on 2 new Swedish consuls. Ivan Troedsson, a civil engineer, took up his role in the consular district of Yokohama and Tokyo, while Lawrence Weirin succeeded James in Kobe and Osaka. Although Troedsson was designated consul for Yokohama, his actual office was located in the legation in Tokyo, rather than the Yokohama consulate. This consulate welcomed a new vice-consul in January 1942, the Swedish national Nils Kallen, who was just 35 at the time. He had previously served as one of the local directors of SKF and assumed responsibility for all administrative matters at the consulate, which included the files that Guston and others had been previously managing. Kallen's tasks, however, differed significantly from those of his predecessors. The number of humanitarian and legal cases to address surged, which escalated the communications between the consulate and the legation from a handful of letters each month to daily correspondence with Bagge. Soon, the volume of Kallen's work became overwhelming, leading Bagge to expand the mission staff by introducing new administrative roles. In May 1942, he appointed Gunnar Wester, another Swede, to assist the Yokohama consulate as a secretary. Additionally, the minister brought on new staff for the legation. Mr. A. Olofsson, also Swedish, joined on January 1, 1942, followed by Ulf Wennblad and Niels E. Eriksson, the latter being a representative of Carl Ekman and Company, with whom Bagge had a long-standing relationship. The legation also employed a Japanese typist, Mrs. Uchiyama, an errand boy, Kei Oyama, and a chauffeur, Kei Kawahara. Together with Eriksson and Wennblad, they were assigned to the newly created Section B at the legation, which corresponded with the Section B at the UD. The only individual removed from their position was a Japanese interpreter, Mr. Kokubu, who Baggy reported as likely acting as a police special agent. Although Baggy recognized this was not unusual, it compelled him to find a replacement, a new interpreter named Mr. Hashimoto. Notably, the new recruits for the legation were primarily Swedish and Japanese nationals, marking the end of the era when honorary consuls of different nationalities could be appointed. Only a Swedish passport could assure some level of recognition from Japanese military and civilian authorities. Bagé indeed attempted to offer protection to other nationals under his diplomatic oversight. One notable case involved Mr. George Addis, who had lived in Yokohama for almost 20 years but lacked a valid passport to confirm his nationality. He claimed Greek heritage, yet his youth in Romania led the Greek legation to doubt him, denying him a passport and leaving him effectively stateless. After failing to persuade the Greek minister to acknowledge George Addis, Bagé attempted to enlist him at the legation, claiming he needed an interpreter for Greek-English translations, despite the fact that the Swedish legation wasn't responsible for Greek affairs. This request was denied by the military authorities. However, Bagé successfully hired other foreigners, including Danish national Mr. E.F. Johansson, who worked with the legation until mid-May 1945, when he was detained by Japanese police after Denmark's liberation by the Allies. A Portuguese citizen, Mr. R. da Silva, and a Korean office boy also joined Bagé's staff. By May 1943, about 18 months post-Pearl Harbor, the mission had expanded to 20 staff members, of which 11 were Swedes. Yet, this was still insufficient. Bagé requested an additional official from Sweden to assist the diplomats in Tokyo. The Swedish Foreign Office suggested sending a senior official to oversee Section B. However, Bagé had already appointed Eriksson to that role, believing him ideal due to his 20 years in Japan and fluent Japanese. Bagé asserted that these attributes were vital for the head of Section B, responsible for POW camp visits and sensitive negotiations with Japanese military and civilian officials. The practical solution was to elevate Eriksson to full diplomatic status. Bagé sought a diplomatic passport for him, allowing Eriksson to take on the role of legation secretary. Numerous occasions arose where Bagé's advocacy for his charges clashed with Japanese authorities, though it's important to note that the onset of war with the Allies also led to significant confusion among Japanese agencies. The approach to dealing with protecting powers that represented enemy interests likely wasn't considered before the war began. It took the Gaimusho 3 months to issue official guidelines outlining the rights and responsibilities of these protecting powers. Japan committed to following standard practices, granting diplomatic representatives the following rights. 1. Access to the diplomatic personnel of the represented nation. 2. The ability to manage the properties, archives, and furnishings of the protected power. 3. Support for the diplomats of the protected power regarding their personal matters. 4. The right to seek information about the situation of enemy civilians, including those who were interned or detained. 5. Oversight of the financial matters of the protected power, including the assets of interned and detained individuals. All 5 points came with the stipulation that, according to international law, the Gaimusho and relevant Japanese agencies had to be notified before any of these actions were taken, and prior approval was necessary. The regulations provided clarity. For instance, enemy legation properties remained with their owners despite the war. Enemy buildings, real estate, and bank accounts were not confiscated by Japanese authorities, but were simply sealed during the conflict. Bagé was tasked with the management of foreign assets. While bank accounts were often restricted, the private funds of diplomats and cash held in embassies and consulates could generally be transferred to the Swedish legation. Bagé maintained records for the nations he protected and credited them when he could secure their financial resources. Protecting the properties proved to be more challenging. Initially, the stranded enemy diplomats managed their own buildings since they were confined there, but after the evacuations in summer 1942, Bagé needed to find alternative solutions. He first arranged for the former Japanese staff from the now defunct diplomatic missions to occupy and oversee the properties. However, this method did not work well for the Dutch legation. Consequently, Bagge relocated his own staff into the Dutch buildings, designating von Sydow and Eriksson to reside there. Having a physical presence was the most effective means of protection. Visits to POW camps became a significant aspect of the Swedish mandate in Japan, allowing only individuals with diplomatic status to carry them out. Starting in February 1942, members of Bagge's legation made trips to internment camps around 3 to 4 times each month. The Dennenchofu camp near Tokyo was the most frequently visited, along with other camps in Urawa, Nagasaki, Kogani, and Kobe. Nils Eriksson, the head of Section B, and Consul Troedsson typically oversaw these inspections, supported by Consul Wieren and Secretaries Gowell and von Sydow, and occasionally Minister Bagge himself. After each visit, reports detailing the camp conditions were compiled, with 3 examples from 1942 included in the book's appendix. Over the first 16 months, the Swedes conducted about 50 visits to the camps. However, given that Japan operated hundreds of POW camps and prisons, these visits were not sufficient to provide a thorough understanding of all POW situations. Furthermore, the Gaimusho refused to allow neutral inspections of camps outside of mainland Japan, with few exceptions. Requests to visit the Changi internment camp in Singapore were quickly declined. A complicated situation arose regarding camps in the overseas territories of the Japanese Empire, including Formosa and civilian internees on the Kwantung Peninsula. Consul Kjellin, representing Sweden in Dairen, noted that despite lacking an official mandate, he felt it was his humanitarian duty, as one of the few neutral foreigners there, to assist British citizens interned locally by providing them with food and other necessities. The local authorities were accommodating, granting him permission to visit the interned individuals. Some limited impact outside of Japan was achievable, but it depended on the goodwill of local Japanese officials. It remains uncertain how long such unofficial efforts could last. After Kjellin's letter, there were no further updates on the situation of interned foreigners in Dairen. In addition to diplomats and POWs, the legation was now responsible for the welfare of enemy civilians. This began with 7 Dutch businessmen in Kobe who were arrested and detained right after the war started. They were directors of trading companies or bank managers and, similar to their British counterparts, were accused of espionage a year earlier. Bagge felt the charges were merely a pretext aimed at taking hostages. His best efforts involved making continuous complaints to the Gaimusho and trying to evacuate these civilians via exchange ships. Meanwhile, he ensured their well-being as long as they remained confined. This was a new role, vastly different from the time before Pearl Harbor, when the legation focused mainly on economic matters. The change was also evident in the consulates. Previously, consuls in Yokohama mainly worked on visas, tracking Swedish trade, and assisting Swedes in emergencies. But by 1942, the new vice-consul, Kallen, received orders to look after Dutch, Belgian, Mexican, and later Bolivian consulates in his area. Bagge directed him to protect the consular archives and belongings, while also reporting on the treatment of former consuls. Kallen began visiting the Negishi internment camp by February 25th, where Dutch and Belgian nationals were imprisoned and needed diplomatic support to send messages to their governments and families or request better treatment during illness or financial difficulties. Kallen regularly made cash payments to both interned and free foreign nationals under his care, so they could buy food and clothing for winter. Money was necessary even in an internment camp. Soon, he also began pursuing legal claims against the Japanese authorities on behalf of the people and companies he represented. By late March, he intervened on behalf of the Dutch Japan-China Trading Company regarding the seizure and sale of a steamship that had been captured in Yokohama when the war began. Captured civilian vessels belonging to enemy nations were seized and sold off by Japanese prize courts. Kallen and his superior, Troedsson, assisted the defendants in protecting their assets, despite the slim chances of success. The work of the Swedish mission became remarkably varied. Bagge and his team found themselves deeply involved in issues pertaining to other nations, while Swedish diplomats back home and abroad provided their good offices to Japan. This was not a given. Sweden's foreign ministry could have turned down requests from either party. However, Bagay and the ministry believed that refusing to act as protecting power was not the right approach. In one of his first telegrams to Stockholm after the Pearl Harbor attack, Bagay strongly suggested that Sweden take on responsibilities for Japan, noting that fulfilling such tasks could lead to benefits in other areas. He was optimistic that the Japanese authorities would reciprocate Sweden's efforts in trade matters. His superiors seemed to agree. None of Japan's requests were turned down. The closest diplomatic ally to the Swedish legation was the Swiss mission. While they were not the only neutral legations remaining in Tokyo, Argentina, Portugal, Spain, the USSR, Afghanistan, and the Vatican also had representatives. There are several instances showing that Bagay and his team worked particularly closely with the Swiss. For instance, in July 1942, Vice Consul Callan advised Bagay to seek the Swiss minister's opinion before proceeding on a matter involving Axis and neutral legations in Tokyo. They discussed how neutral states could collaborate to gain concessions from the Gaimusho. Callan only mentioned the Swiss in this context, indicating their importance for coordinating neutral interests. A significant example of cooperation between the Swedish and Swiss legations was their joint inspection of POW camps in Formosa, or Taiwan, in the fall of 1943. This was one of the rare instances in which the Gaimusho allowed inspections of camps outside the mainland. Since Formosa had been part of the Japanese Empire since 1895, the military authorized a joint Swedish-Swiss inspection of 6 POW internment camps from September 21st to October 2nd, 1943. The reason for the visit being conducted by representatives from 2 different neutral countries remains unclear. It could be linked to the passing of the Swiss delegate, Robert Bossert, who tragically died on a mission to Formosa the previous year. Sending 2 diplomats may have been a precaution for their safety. The partnership appeared to yield positive results on another front. Eriksson, who led Section B, stated in his final report that the plan for a joint visit by the Swiss and Swedish delegates initially seemed questionable, but he now believed the benefits were numerous and that more joint visits to camps in Japan should take place. The Swiss delegate, who turned out to be a seasoned and valuable ally, and I could significantly enhance each other's insights and observations. Clearly, the collaboration between the Swedish and Swiss legations yielded tangible outcomes. However, there were few other options available. Japan's adversaries relied on the good offices of either Sweden or Switzerland, as they were the sole viable partners. This is evident from the legation's telegraphic records. In 1942, Bagay mentioned the Swiss government, the Swiss minister, and the Swiss legation on 22 separate occasions, while Spain, Portugal, and the Soviet Union were not referenced at all. Yet this doesn't imply that working together was an easy endeavor for the 2 legations. On the contrary, joint actions needed meticulous planning and execution to be effective, given that the political climate in Japan was very wary of neutral interventions. A prime example of the sensitive situation was how the legations had to handle the Young Men's Christian Association, the only other international humanitarian organization allowed in Japan aside from the International Committee of the Red Cross. Founded in London in 1844, the YMCA developed into a global organization aimed at promoting Christian values and providing young men with sports and mental health activities. By the time of the war, it was well established and, like the ICRC, based in Geneva with national committees all over the world, including Japan. In March 1942, the International YMCA reached out to the Swedish legation for assistance in organizing relief work for POWs in Japan and the occupied regions. The legation, eager to help, passed the request on to the National Japanese YMCA, led by Saito Soichi, a prominent public figure, devoted second-generation Christian, and a strong advocate for amicable relations with the United States. He was one of the last YMCA delegates in the U.S. in 1941 and the second Japanese individual to return to the United States after the war in 1948. However, he also had a reputation for defending Japan's actions in Manchukuo and heavily criticized the International YMCA for its alignment with the League of Nations. Under his direction, the Japanese YMCA withdrew from the international organization in 1941. His mixed nationalist views presented a significant obstacle to the success of the relief efforts launched by the Geneva headquarters. A report from the legation highlighted that extensive discussions with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the military administration revealed that the Japanese YMCA was not only ineffective in engaging with the authorities, but also appeared to be more inclined, likely due to external pressures, to support the Japanese soldiers. Saito left such a negative impression on the legation that Baggy and his team concluded that a neutral committee needed to be formed to salvage the initiative. This committee was established on June 22, 1942, under the auspices of both the Swedish and Swiss legations. The day-to-day functions of the committee were overseen by Eriksson, as the staff executing the committee's missions belonged to Section B. Through this arrangement, Section B adopted a new identity as the office of the Neutral Committee of the YMCA. The Swiss remained mostly uninvolved in this initiative, while Swiss envoy Camille Gorget lent his name to the Neutral Committee for a more international presence. He and his team had little actual engagement in the work. Their only substantial collaboration came from K. Bernath, who, along with Eriksson, formed a working committee to oversee operations. The absence of the Swiss minister, and notably of the Swiss ICRC delegate, Fritz Paravicini, from the committee's real work stemmed from two factors. Firstly, the Swiss were already heavily occupied with other relief efforts through the ICRC. It seemed like a logical division of responsibilities for the Swedish legation to assist the YMCA. Unlike the International Committee of the Red Cross, the Neutral Committee of the YMCA chose not to get involved in the treatment of prisoners of war. To avoid upsetting the Japanese authorities and to keep their mandates distinct, the YMCA made a clear decision not to investigate the conditions of POWs in the camps. Their focus was solely on delivering relief supplies aimed at enhancing the mental and physical well-being of the prisoners. They provided books, sports equipment, gardening tools, and musical instruments, allowing POWs to engage in activities that helped relieve the immense stress and hardship they faced. This approach aligned with YMCA objectives and prevented any overlap with the efforts of Paravicini and the ICRC, who managed the supply of food, medicine, and clothing. Moreover, the YMCA's initiative carried risks for the ongoing activities of both legations. The Swiss legation was particularly cautious, not wanting to undermine its relationship with Japanese officials. In the early days of the YMCA effort, when the military responded with outright rejection and suspicion toward the committee's appeals, the Swiss legation felt uneasy about the potential impact on their role as a protective power and their collaboration with the ICRC. They even considered pulling one of their members from the YMCA Neutral Committee to ensure his work with civilian internees wouldn't be hindered. The Swiss had to tread carefully, as their own mandates were already fragile. Supporting another initiative assisting Japan's enemies by involving Swiss personnel would likely raise further objections from Japanese bureaucrats, who were already mistrustful of neutral activities. The fear of espionage and distrust toward foreigners peaked during those years. Only after several months did the Neutral Committee start to see success, as the Ministry of War's resistance to distributing relief supplies began to diminish. Eriksson was finally able to reach out to the War Prisoners Information Bureau and start building trust. Bag's personal involvement during this pivotal phase was essential. Through the repeated dinner invitations from Major General Hamada, the chief of the Bureau, trust was established that allowed staff members to visit POW camps and fulfill the YMCA missions. However, challenges persisted, as local authorities could still prevent camp visits even with Major Hamada's approval. Treating the military authorities with extreme caution was essential. At the slightest indication of disapproval, plans had to be abandoned. Ultimately, the careful execution of these missions yielded some success. By the end of 1943, Eriksson and Bernath reported the distribution of over 16,000 books and magazines, along with spending Yen 25,000 on musical instruments and an equal amount for sports equipment, indoor games, and other leisure items. To put this into perspective, the highest monthly salary for Swedish staff at the Neutral Committee's office was Yen 800. The The Neutral Committee also facilitated sending thousands of Japanese books to Japanese internees in the United States and Canada to support YMCA relief efforts there. They aimed to broaden their operations by seeking assistance from Swedes and Swiss outside Japan. In Shanghai, Gustav Asker was appointed as the local representative, while F. Kengelbacher, a Swiss national, took the role in Hong Kong. In Bangkok and Manila, Swedish consuls F. Enstedt and H. Janssen also assumed similar positions. Unfortunately, only the representative in Thailand managed to conduct tangible relief work in POW camps, as the others did not gain permission from local Japanese authorities to enter the camps or were recognized as YMCA representatives. As a result, the global network of the Neutral Committee had a limited impact. Nonetheless, this situation highlights the Swedish legation's commitment to seizing every opportunity to extend its humanitarian efforts beyond the confines of mainland Japan. In Stockholm, however, diplomatic progress was slower, as the unsatisfactory arrangement of having only one Japanese chargé d'affaires and one military attaché persisted well into 1942. The Swedish government hoped for a stronger Japanese presence, but neither the UD nor Envoy Bagge had the influence to convince the Japanese. All Bagge could do was raise the unfortunate situation during his discussions with senior Japanese officials. It wasn't until late October 1942, after meeting with Prime Minister Tojo Hideki, that he found genuine interest in appointing a senior diplomat. Okamoto Suemasa, previously the general consul in Shanghai and in Calcutta when war with the Allies began, was appointed as Minister Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary to Sweden. Interned by British authorities in India, he was freed in August thanks to a prisoner exchange organized by neutral parties. He was nominated envoy to Sweden by the Emperor on November 26, 1942, taking up the role the following month. This appointment was notable, coinciding with the establishment of the Ministry of Greater East Asia on the 1st of November, 1942, which merged several bureaus, effectively halving the Gaimusho's staff and diminishing its influence within the cabinet. At this juncture, the strengthening of diplomatic ties with Sweden was not immediately obvious. It's unclear whether this was merely based on Prime Minister Tojo's instincts or part of a broader strategy towards neutral Europe, given the circumstances. However, as time progressed, Japan's prior indifference towards Stockholm flipped dramatically. As the war worsened in both the Pacific and Europe, more diplomats from the Gaimusho, along with personnel from the Army, Navy, and Air Force, began arriving at the Scandinavian outpost. By early 1945, Sweden had welcomed 15 Japanese diplomats, a stark contrast to just 3 years earlier. With Okamoto's arrival in late 1942, the Gaimusho actively began utilizing Stockholm for intelligence operations. Okamoto started relaying intelligence reports back to Tokyo, initially filled with his personal observations and general insights into Swedish opinions, including his assessments from meetings with prominent officials like Gunnar Hägglöf, head of the Foreign Trade Section. Over time, these assessments grew increasingly sophisticated. The scarcity of reliable sources limits a clear description of his contacts. However, the intercepted telegrams from U.S. intelligence suggest he leveraged his relationships with high-ranking diplomats and influential people in Stockholm to gather reports on not just Swedish matters, but also the security situations involving the Soviets, Germans, and Americans. For instance, he mentions one of my agents here who has contacts in Russia to inform his ministry about a supposed meeting between U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull and Soviet Ambassador Maxim Litvinov. In another instance, Okamoto communicated back to Tokyo that he had conversed with an authority on Russia here who has connections with the Soviets. Regarding Soviet military preparations for impending German offensives, the minister was seeking ways to enhance the breadth of his intelligence assessments through local informants. Additionally, Japanese espionage included the military attaché Onodera Makoto. Until 1940, Japan did not have military attachés in Stockholm, as the Scandinavian post was previously located in Helsinki, with Officer Nishimura Toshio in charge. However, with the outbreak of the Soviet-Finnish Winter War, Helsinki became too perilous, leading to the evacuation of all Japanese diplomats. Nishimura moved to Stockholm, and was succeeded by Onodera in early 1941, who had previous experience in the Baltic from his earlier posting in Riga. He began his work in Stockholm in February 1941 and quickly re-established connections with former friends and informants from his time in Latvia. Onodera's wife, Yuriko, documented their life in Sweden in her memoirs. She noted that Onodera received vital intelligence from Hungarian, German, Estonian, and Polish informants. For example, his Polish collaborators provided insight into developments in Moscow and London, which he communicated to Tokyo under the title BU Info. Records from U.S. counterintelligence reports, known as the Magic Summaries, illustrate that U.S. codebreakers intercepted some of this information, though not all. One summary from August 24, 1943, notes a BU intelligence report dated May 8th. All reports from BU intelligence seem to originate from the Japanese military attaché in Stockholm, conveying information that claims to come from London and Moscow. The British suspect that this information is supplied by agents. However, there aren't enough BU reports available yet to allow for reliable assessment. Onodera's links in Poland remained intact throughout the war, and his spies went unnoticed. Though some of his reports were captured by British and U.S. intelligence, many went undetected. In contrast, Minister Okamoto, like many of his fellow diplomats, left a clear record of his actions. He was convinced that the Japanese cipher code hadn't been compromised and continued to send his reports to Tokyo via telegraph, which the Allies easily intercepted. The Magic Summaries reveal clear insights. Prior to December 1942, information about Japanese activities in Stockholm was scarce and sporadic, but once Okamoto began his operations, Stockholm appeared frequently in reports. Two conclusions emerged from this situation. First, it was the war's progression in Europe that heightened Tokyo's interest in Stockholm. Otherwise, Minister Bagge wouldn't have had to struggle for nearly 2 years to get a new minister plenipotentiary for Sweden. Second, Swedish authorities seemed to have no issue with the influx of Japanese diplomats, as they could have stopped their arrival by withholding their accreditation. Allowing 15 Japanese diplomats went beyond mere etiquette. It indicated acceptance of Japan's newfound purpose for Sweden. But why would the Foreign Office oppose such developments? They granted equal rights to all belligerents. By 1945, Germany and the USSR had 21 accredited diplomats in Stockholm, the British had 29, and the United States had 45. More crucially, the Foreign Office was not against strengthening ties with Japan, as this could serve Sweden's interests in East Asia. As a neutral party, Sweden only needed to ensure a level playing field. Unsurprisingly, events following Pearl Harbor strained Swedish-Japanese trade relations. In the initial 2 years of Japan's war against the Allies, Sweden managed limited exports amounting to about 3 million yen. This was just a third of the export value from 1941 and a mere fraction of the 49 million yen Japan imported from Sweden in 1937. The official statistics reveal notably low levels of trade. Import data from 1942 and 1943 is absent in the records for both Japan and Sweden. Moreover, the available figures should be viewed with caution. The Japanese numbers, particularly in the early years of the war, are likely understated. Telegrams from Bagge indicate that Swedish exports were valued at several million crowns. For instance, in March 1942, there remained ball bearings worth 2.3 million Swedish kroner in Yokohama, and another 2 million Swedish kroner worth of SKF products en route through Siberia. Sweden sought to import rubber, soybean, tin, and tungsten from Japan, while Japan aimed to utilize Swedish raw materials like nickel and cadmium, along with Swedish ball bearings and piano wire, all of which served military purposes. Swedish wool and yarn continued to be in demand as well. Both nations recognized the need for negotiations, though they operated in secrecy. The Swedish Bureau of Foreign Trade, led by Gunnar Hägglöf, understood that trade with Japan would face strong opposition from the Allies and might be unpopular with Swedish workers producing these goods. Regardless, negotiations persisted for several reasons. Bagge was particularly anxious about the possibility of Swedish goods being seized for the war without proper compensation. Since the summer of 1941, he He had reported the risks of expropriation or undervalued payments, especially concerning nickel shipments. One such shipment of 69 tons of nickel and cadmium arrived in Yokohama in late November 1941, but languished in the port for months, forcing Baggy to navigate lengthy negotiations for its release at a fair price. These discussions were further complicated by Japan's rapid economic inflation, with Baggy noting a four-fold increase in price levels since 1937. Current evaluations of Japanese war inflation suggest a similar range, with increases between 2 and 6 times the levels of 1936. The instability in general pricing made Swedish negotiations considerably more challenging. The most significant shift in trade relations stemmed from a dramatic change in Japan's production methods. From early 1942 onwards, the country's major industries became so closely intertwined with the national government that they were nearly indistinguishable. Markets vanished, and all trade shifted to serve the demands of the war economy. The largest corporations, such as Mitsubishi and Mitsui, were instructed by the government to conduct trade in alignment with its directives. In February 1942, Baggy reported that the Finance Ministry had tasked Mitsubishi with a unique role as the government's buyer of goods. The legation was in discussions with the Foreign Ministry regarding selling principles, while a final contract and delivery details were being prepared for Mitsubishi in collaboration with the planning board and military authorities, who held decision-making power. This shift toward nationalization distinctly altered trade relations with Sweden and positioned Baggy at the heart of business dealings. As the official representative of the Swedish state, he held a formidable bargaining advantage. Companies like Ekman, Gedelius, and SKF became less relevant. Baggy could negotiate significantly better price concessions on their behalf, and with a sense of pride, he noted in March that concerning the nickel question from last October, Gedelius could not even secure half the price I did. In the same message, Baggy clearly outlined that the trading firms were no longer equipped to manage their core business. The legation believed it could safeguard substantial values that were otherwise at risk due to war. The companies seemed ill-prepared in this regard and had not initiated any efforts to mitigate war-related risks. Given the current circumstances, it would be inappropriate and detrimental for the companies to interfere in the sales process. Nevertheless, in their self-interest, the legation would reach out to the firms to help maintain price levels, which was especially important for band and frame saw steel. For this purpose, Gedelius was consulted about steel shipments. Over the next 3.5 years, the legation remained at the center of business dealings, negotiating prices and quantities of goods for import and export. Some trading companies voiced concerns about the interference from the legation, but Baggy firmly believed that, given the new circumstances, foreign firms needed state support. He laid out his argument. It was crucial to sell stranded goods promptly to mitigate the risk of confiscation and damage. If left to private firms, they wouldn't be able to avoid the sales and price controls imposed by government agencies and business organizations. Sales would be fragmented and shipments divided. Only the most desirable items would be sold, and with significantly reduced profit margins. The legation engaged with the Foreign Office and the Ministry of Finance, negotiating adjustments to the principles involved, bypassing the usual control procedures. This allowed for sales to be organized more efficiently, adhering to consistent processes and on a larger scale. The criticism from Gedelius lacks credibility and reflects either a misunderstanding or unwillingness to grasp the situation. Whether that assessment is accurate or not, the legation's records indicate that in the forthcoming years, all trade issues exceeding a few thousand yen were handled by the legation. This included everything from wool and yarn to large shipments of ball bearings, nickel, and piano wire. The legation played a significant role, with entire telegrams focusing on matters dubbed the nickel question and the rubber question. The former being a good Baggy facilitated the import of to Japan, while the latter was the key export item that the Swedish Trade Bureau sought from Japan. In addition to its role as a trade organizer, the legation also acted as a financial intermediary through its account at the Yokohama Specie Bank, enabling a clearing system with the Riksbank in Stockholm. Any trade settled in Japanese yen that needed to generate income in crowns had to go through this clearing, which in turn created liquidity for other operations of the legation. Bagge merely had to debit the accounts he maintained for the trading companies, from which they earned interest. After negotiations with the Gaimusho, the Japanese agreed that the funds could be utilized within the entire yen block. This allowed funds to be allocated for the well-being of the Ningpo and Miramar crews in Hong Kong and Saigon, as well as for the payments to consulates in Shanghai, Saigon, Hong Kong, and Darren, in addition to enabling the legation to fulfill its protecting power responsibilities. For example, in the summer of 1942, Bagge informed the UD that the Section B incurred costs of roughly 175,000 yen during its 6-month existence, borrowing money from SKF at an interest rate of 4.25%. This access to yen-based funds is why the legation never faced a liquidity crisis. Humanitarian activities were supported by their dealings with Swedish companies. From the records, it appears that the nationalization of industries in Japan resulted in a form of quasi-nationalization of Swedish trade through the legation. While Swedish companies themselves weren't nationalized, their Japanese subsidiaries became entirely reliant on the legation and Bagge's authority to negotiate directly with Japanese ministries. The companies were relegated to mere execution roles. The intertwining of trade and diplomacy is evident in the many former businessmen, like Ericsson, who became part of the legation staff, and in Ericsson's case, even a diplomat. Overall, while Bagge managed to secure small concessions for Swedish trade, it couldn't prevent the deteriorating trade situation in Asia. On December 30th, 1941, Japanese forces captured the Swedish steamer SS Miramar at the Saigon port. Bagge found out about this incident only 10 days later when the consulate in Vietnam notified him about the ship's seizure and the Swedish crew's detention in an undisclosed location. Japanese officials claimed that the neutral ship was suspected of carrying contraband and would thus be turned over to a prize court. Bagge immediately protested this treatment and the potential appropriation, taking the matter to Foreign Minister Togo, where he expressed his concerns sharply, emphasizing that Sweden's goodwill as a neutral, friendly nation should not be taken for granted, and that Japan's potential gain from confiscating Swedish property could hardly outweigh the damage to trust. Unfortunately, these strong words brought no resolution. Over the next 2 years, the Miramar case became a significant strain on Swedish-Japanese relations, with the Japanese refusing to release the ship. The Swedes had to reach a compromise that allowed the Japanese Navy to lease the Miramar at a favorable rate, payable in yen. The crew was released and could return home, yet the ship had been effectively handed over to Japan. Minister Bagge emphasized in his reports on the matter that this is not a case of free negotiations, as the Japanese set the terms through prize courts and confiscations. Consequently, the Miramar was involuntarily leased to the Japanese state, and it wasn't the only instance. Another ship, the Ningpo MV, faced a similar fate. It had sustained significant collateral damage during the Battle of Hong Kong while anchored when the war began, leading to its repossession by Japan for use as a merchant steamer. Unfortunately, it was sunk on the 29th of June, 1944, by a torpedo fired by a U.S. submarine while sailing under the Japanese flag. A notable case of concern was the treatment of Swedish interests in Japanese-occupied territories in China. Although the empire's official foreign policy claimed it wouldn't meddle with neutral interests, the reality painted a different picture, especially for the American Far Eastern Match Company, a subsidiary of Svenska Tändsticks AB, known for producing matches, lighters, and tobacco. Due to an unfortunate name similarity, the Shanghai-based subsidiary was seized by the Japanese army at the start of the war. Bagge attempted to clarify the misunderstanding, insisting that the company was entirely owned and managed by Swedish capital, but his repeated efforts at the Gaimusho yielded little result. The company was not returned and was unable to operate. The issue was so significant that the Swedish Foreign Ministry got involved, negotiating with the newly appointed Minister Okamoto a year later. The treatment of Swedish interests regarding Stab and the Miramar became two of the most contentious issues affecting Swedish-Japanese relations until at least 1943, dampening Minister Bagge's initial hopes that Sweden's good offices would lead to favorable treatment. By 1944, the European war had taken a turn for the worse for the Axis powers, leaving the submarine route from Germany as the only way to transport goods from Sweden to Japan. Steel balls, ball bearings, and piano wire were sent to Japan beneath the waves. Onodera's office handled purchases in Stockholm, but a Swedish company was responsible for transportation. The amounts were significantly smaller than when they could rely on proper shipments or rail transport through Siberia. By late 1943, all correspondence regarding rubber exports to Sweden from the Swedish legation ceased, and the last telegram concerning nickel sales to Japan was sent on February 1, 1944. In the final 18 months of the war, trade between the two nations nearly halted. Diplomatic relations also began to deteriorate in 1944. The mandatory evacuation of the legation to Karuizawa, a town in the Nagano Mountains, widened the gap between the Swedish mission and its host. Bagge and his neutral colleagues from Spain, Switzerland, Portugal, and Turkey collectively protested with notes against their forced removal from Tokyo. However, the Gaimusho insisted the evacuation was essential for the diplomats' safety from potential U.S. air raids, claiming it posed no real disadvantage since there would be a Gaimusho branch office in Karuizawa to ensure ongoing communication with the Japanese government. Bagge and the other neutral ministers were skeptical, viewing these measures as an effort to restrict their access to vital information about the war's progression. Tokyo was the hub of political activity, and being cut off hindered the protecting powers' ability to fulfill their responsibilities. The strict prohibition on traveling to Tokyo without permission and police escort was seen as a blatant violation of the diplomatic freedom of movement that international law guarantees. Notably, representatives of the Axis powers were not subject to this restriction, highlighting that the Gaimusho's main concern was not the diplomats' safety, but rather obstructing the flow of information to neutral governments, which could pass it on to the Allies. Written complaints were ineffective, the policy remained unchanged, and the diplomats stayed cut off from Tokyo. However, it should be acknowledged that the evacuation to Karuizawa did protect the legation, as the Gaimusho had asserted. No one from the legation staff was harmed during the heavy bombings of Tokyo in 1945. The limited access to capital posed a significant challenge, as representing foreign interests and caring for Swedish citizens became the legation's top priorities. Living conditions deteriorated on the Japanese mainland and in its dwindling empire overseas. In February 1944, Bagge reported another united neutral effort, alongside the Swiss and Spanish legation, to demand the evacuation of their citizens from Japanese-occupied areas in the Pacific. The Swiss had been particularly insistent for months about wanting their citizens evacuated from these occupied regions, yet the Japanese consistently ignored these appeals. Therefore, the joint diplomatic action sought to increase pressure on the Gaimusho to improve the living conditions for neutral nationals affected. However, this initiative proved unsuccessful, as neutral protests about their treatment had little effect. Meanwhile, reports from Hong Kong and the Philippines regarding mistreatment of neutral nationals continued to flood in, especially during the latter half of 1944 into early 1945. The most horrific incidents occurred in Manila, where more than 100 Spanish and 20 Swiss citizens were executed by Japanese soldiers during the city's final battle. The Swedes, however, were fortunate. No casualties were reported among the 17 Swedish families living in Manila. Only one Swede, Adolf Graef, was injured by a gunshot from a Japanese officer, but he and his family survived. The events in Manila ultimately led the Spanish to relinquish their responsibility for representing Japanese interests in the Americas. Sweden faced no such dilemma. In one of his final telegrams before returning to Sweden in April 1945, Bagge instructed his ministry to prepare for the Japanese request to take over the country's interests in the United States, which Spain had previously protected. He stressed that if the Swedish government chose to accept this mandate, It should leverage the request to gain significant concessions for their role as protecting power in Japan. He sought improved food rations for POWs, the liberation of imprisoned Norwegians and Swedes, and an end to arbitrary arrests. In the end, Japan persuaded the Swiss to advocate for its interests in the Americas, leaving Bage unable to voice his demands. Still, this situation highlighted how Swedish diplomats, much like their Swiss counterparts, sought every possible avenue to secure concessions from the Gaimusho, aiming to improve the treatment of themselves and their clients. Despite numerous challenges, Sweden had yet to deliver one of its most significant wartime favors to Japan. By the latter half of 1944, it became clear that Japan would not emerge victorious in this total war. With the United States Navy advancing, Imperial forces in retreat, and American bombers wreaking havoc on mainland cities, many Japanese, both in and out of political spheres, recognized the urgency of ending the conflict. But how could they achieve that? A negotiated peace that allowed Japanese militarism to persist was off the table for the United States, which made it clear that only unconditional surrender would be deemed acceptable in Washington. Meanwhile, even peace-oriented cabinet members in Tokyo, like Foreign Minister Shigemitsu, believed that any resolution must align with Japan's honor. The core issue was the preservation of Japan's political structure, which was intricately tied to the survival of the emperor. Evaluating the emperor's political and physical safety became crucial. One of the best opportunities for this lay through the good office of Minister Bage. The attack on Pearl Harbor marked a pivotal change in Swedish-Japanese relations. Diplomatically, Sweden emerged as Japan's second-largest protecting power, one of three neutral nations responsible for facilitating the exchange of enemy nationals among the warring parties. Sweden's role as Japan's protecting power in Hawaii and its provision of exchange ships made it an essential neutral ally for Tokyo. Furthermore, Sweden worked alongside Switzerland in various efforts to safeguard Allied prisoners of war, diplomats, and civilians. It also supported private humanitarian initiatives by aiding the Neutral Committee of the YMCA, comprised of Swedish and Swiss diplomats, which served as the Japan-based branch of the International YMCA. Through this committee, the Swedes could direct YMCA goods and funds to interned enemy nationals within the empire. While Switzerland partnered with the International Committee of the Red Cross, Sweden became the ally of the YMCA. For Swedish businesses, everything shifted with Japan's new approach to wartime production. Trade and diplomacy became so intertwined that they were nearly indistinguishable. Vidar Bage was not just Sweden's top diplomat in Japan, he also became the leading figure for Swedish commerce. He was the only one with the authority to negotiate prices with the Ministry of Finance. Japan's nationalization largely led to a quasi-nationalization of Swedish trade within the country under its diplomatic representation. This situation reached a point where Swedish companies voiced concerns about the legation's interference in their operations. Minister Bage defended these actions, stating that, under the new circumstances, only the Swedish state, represented by him, had the standing necessary for negotiations with Japan. He was able to secure better concessions than the company leaders could. Ironically, this new role for Sweden emerged alongside Japan's waning interest in bilateral relations with Scandinavia. For nearly 2 years, Japan did not have a minister plenipotentiary in Stockholm and operated its legation at minimal capacity. Sweden found this situation deeply frustrating, as it limited their ability to advocate for their interests in Tokyo. While the Gaimusho cited a lack of skilled personnel as the official reason, the more likely truth was that the geopolitical climate had rendered Sweden isolated in Japan's eyes, making diplomatic efforts seem unnecessary. However, this perception dramatically shifted in the latter years of the war. Once the Gaimusho and Japan's military recognized Stockholm's potential as a hub for intelligence gathering, Japan dispatched not only a new minister, but also several delegates to obtain information on Allied activities. Sweden's growing role in providing diplomatic and humanitarian services significantly increased the workload for the UD. To address this, they established a division solely focused on foreign interests, known as Section B. Bage appointed a former Swedish company director to lead the local chapter of that section. Overall, Baggy had to bring on numerous additional Swedish and Japanese employees to manage the heightened demand, expanding his mission from just a few individuals to over 20. Along with the clear need to help those in peril, Baggy advised his government to accept requests for Sweden's good offices, believing that doing so would place Sweden in a favorable position for its own interests, particularly in Japan. Unfortunately, those hopes did not materialize. As the war dragged on, it became increasingly challenging for Bagge to maintain commercial interests and safeguard even Swedish citizens within the Japanese Empire.